Great, thanks, Karina. So yes, look, well, we will get started. We've got a full and interesting program ahead of us over the next hour. So as Karina, my colleague from the Pawsey Centre, introduced me as I'm the Executive Director of the Pawsey Supercomputing Centre, and I'm really pleased to welcome you here for this webinar. We are exploring the future and the possibilities for extreme scale computing, following on from Pawsey's announcement last week of the next generation of our systems to be installed here in Australia. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm currently talking to you from Whadjuk country and Whadjuk, and pay my respects to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation here in Western Australia. Pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and also acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands in which people are participating in this this webinar today. We have a really fantastic lineup of speakers to engage with you today. We are recording this event, so we will make it available afterwards. And we do have an opportunity for Q&A. So we just encourage you to put your questions into the chat, the webinar chat, and we'll moderate those and get to those towards the latter part of the session. So today's session really is built on the back of our announcement last week that we are installing a new system here at Pawsey, and it really reflects, I think, what an amazing year we've had in terms of science. It's been an incredibly challenging year, but science is leading some of the responses to those challenges in areas of, obviously the pandemic response, but in medical research, climate change, and discoveries relating to fundamental understanding of our galaxy and the universe. And the power and possibilities of those discoveries are enabled by world-class supercomputing infrastructure, such as that we support here at the Pawsey Supercomputing Centre. So last week we announced our new system architecture, an HPE Cray investment that's really the biggest infrastructure upgrade that we've had at Pawsey since we opened in 2009. This new system will deliver approximately 50 petaflops of compute power, almost a 30 times increase in the compute capability of this national centre, and replace the existing systems at Magnus and Galaxy. Importantly, those system upgrades will be at least 10 times more energy efficient than the current architecture. So at today's event, we're bringing together leading researchers from a range of industries to discuss how this new capacity for discovery and breakthroughs using modern supercomputers, what it will enable and what it will look like. And we'll explore those possibilities through three interesting conversations and insights with leading professors, and look forward to the future of extreme scale computing in Australia. So I'm pleased to introduce the three speakers. We have Professor Alan Mark from the University of Queensland. He's sitting there with wisteria, I think, from the arches at the University of Queensland behind him, which he's going to speak to us today. Has a medical research background. His bio is interesting. He's a distinguished researcher that has had appointments in Europe and awarded for his research. He's always wanted to know how living systems work, in particular how different components within cells, how they can spontaneously self-assemble into functional structures. Understanding that complexity means delving into more and more detail, right down to individual atomic interactions. He really uses the power of supercomputing to unlock that really fundamental interaction at the atomic level. At a personal level, as someone who has a little bit of a fear of medical matters and needles and so on, much to the amusement of my colleagues, I absolutely applaud the use of computational methods to have medical breakthroughs. My second colleague to introduce is Professor Melanie Johnston-Hollett. She's an internationally prominent radio astronomer working in the space between astrophysics, computer science, and big data. She's the director of the Curtin Institute of Computation, and also the director of the Murchison Wide Field Array, which is one of the precursor telescopes that we support here at Pawsey for the Square Kilometre Array project. she has also been involved in the design and construction and operation of several major radio telescopes around the world. And these telescopes are at the forefront of massive increases in data processing and analysing massive quantities of data. Melanie's research interests span the intersection between radio astronomy, signal processing, and big data analytics, and she leads multidisciplinary teams here in Perth. Melanie was one of the first senior researchers and colleagues that I got to know when I joined Pawsey. And my anecdote to share about Melanie is sitting in a small plane, being comforted by cheesecake as we took off from the Bellardi research station at the MRO. There was only about 7 or 8 of us on that plane. It was cheesecake made in Bellardi, which is about 800 kilometres north here of Perth, and that was a very comforting memory that we took off on a little plane with that food. Last but not least, Professor Amanda Barnard. She is one of Australia's most highly awarded computational scientists and leads a significant research group at the Australian National University. She's internationally recognised and has had appointments in Oxford and at Queen's College. With more than 20 years experience in high performance computing and computational modelling, she's a champion and advocate for computational research in Australia. She sits on the boards of various organisations in this area. And importantly for Pawsey, she chaired our Capital Refresh user reference group. So she's been an important advocate for the research community here and influencing the way this new system architecture is going to be adopted. My anecdote about Amanda is I can thank Amanda in part for being in this job. She was on my selection panel, so I will be very nice to Amanda in any of the questions that get passed here today. But I do thank her publicly for being part of the selection panel that got me this job. So with that introduction, I'll move now to the topics at hand. We are looking back before we look forward. So we are looking at the last decade of research and some of the biggest scientific discoveries over the last 10 years and how they've been enabled by high performance computing. And we argue that supercomputers have the potential to solve some of the most pressing contemporary challenges of today. And some of those breakthroughs will be enabled by high performance computing and the ability to process massive amounts of data. So in the last decade, scientists finished sequencing the entire human genome, successfully mapped our galaxy, and made significant headways into precision medicine and genome engineering. So to kick off our discussion today, I'll turn to Melanie and ask her to look back over the last 10 years and what, in your views, were some of the most significant scientific discoveries in radio astronomy that were made possible through advancements in computing and data analysis? And what was the role of high performance computing in those breakthroughs?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So first of all, back to your anecdote about the plane, I should just say I'm scared of flying. So the cheesecake and Mark were particularly important, being in a small aircraft, leaving from the Murchison Radio Astronomy Observatory to come back to Perth. So I think for me, one of the most interesting things that's happened in radio astronomy in particular, but in astronomy more generally over the last decade, is the deepening of our understanding of black holes. So the recent Nobel Prize in physics was awarded to teams that actually looked at how black holes form and develop and their role in the sort of ecology of the universe. Now, that work was done with optical telescopes, but we've had the very interesting and I think groundbreaking imaging of a black hole done with the Event Horizon Telescope in the last year or so. And that actually is using a network of radio telescopes around the world and taking those data, comparing them to each other, and then generating an image, which is done on a supercomputer. So I think that's a truly astonishing result that astronomers have managed to achieve. And it's all thanks to supercomputing. And that seems to be the way that we're going to have to go forward as we try and, uncover more and more about the universe.
Yeah, indeed. So over to you, Alan. What were the biggest discoveries in the last sort of decade in health that were enabled by supercomputing, in your view?
I mean, it's actually more challenging when I was thinking about it, because it's really quite ubiquitous in terms of how things are being used. So I just wanted to mention there's been, certainly in rational drug design, computation has always played a major role. And we're really getting to the point now where things like with Immunib is a targeted anti-cancer drug. It attacks a tyrosine protein kinase. We have hundreds of protein kinases in our body. This one was designed to attack a particular mutation which is found in chronic myelogenous leukemia. And the fact that it could be so targeted is really, really clear. But you also mentioned the human genome and the whole transformation in genomics and genetics. People think of sequencing as being an experimental technique, where the very rapid sequencing techniques which are being used now, where people in parallel generate very small fragments, it's actually the computational component of that which actually makes that possible. And so when we're hearing of things like fragments of DNA being found in wastewater, that is due in part to the power of modern computers to be able to disentangle huge numbers of sequences and to reconstruct, to work out exactly which organisms those things actually came from. And finally, what the other area which I think has transformed the way that I view things is that when you have a pap smear or when you get histology, that once you needed a doctor always to look at that and to give a individual opinion, and what is always a subjective opinion. Now these can be processed automatically through image processing techniques, which require an enormous amount of computer power to both match and combine them. And I think this is going to be certainly transforming things both now and into the future.
Yeah, tremendous, tremendous. So finally to you, Amanda, can you share with us how high performance computing has advanced research in computational science over the last decade?
Yes, thanks, Mark. So computational science is very broad. It covers all areas that we've already heard about and many other areas of science as well. My observation is that there are probably three aspects of HPC that have universally enabled computational science to advance. And I think this will probably resonate with some of the researchers that are listening, but maybe also help frame some of the big picture advantages that we have for people who are not in research. The first is accuracy. Making computational models more accurate typically means increasing the resolution. And this can be spatial increments or time steps or the size of basis sets in quantum chemistry or any other fundamental aspect of not just the model, but how that model is implemented. And no matter what we do, this means increasing the amount of memory we need. So the cost of computation increases significantly whenever you increase the resolution, and it just cannot be met these days by even the most advanced conventional computers. No matter how big that server is that sits under your desk and warms your feet, we're still going to need big computers if we want to do high accuracy. The second is scale. And this again is regardless of the scientific domain or which computational models, but we're now able to simulate bigger systems. And this is due to taking advantages of parallel programming and of course massively parallel architectures. Without big high performance computing, there would always be limits on our ability to simulate phenomena that is consistent with real world observations. And the final one, which touches more on the work that I do, is being able to handle a lot more complexity. As we move into more of a data-driven approach to computational science, we're incorporating more things like analytics and informatics, machine learning, AI. We not only need massively parallel computing to generate some of the data sets that we need to train the models, but the models themselves are now becoming too large and too complex for us to train on any kind of conventional hardware. High performance computing goes hand in hand with high performance data. And so if we want to be able to handle all of the complexity we see around us in a virtual sense, we're going to need high performance infrastructure to be able to do that.
Yeah, tremendous. So I think all of our speakers have looked back and demonstrated what we've had advanced through high performance computing and that relationship with now high performance data needs. And I think we can see some glimpses into what's coming. I might reflect here. We've got dozens of organisations that are represented here on the colleagues from organisations all around the country. For those that might not have attended a Pawsey event before, I've just introduced that Pawsey is one of 2 national centres. So we do support over 1,600 researchers currently. We make our resources available through a national merit-based application process, and also support partners directly. The other national centre is NCI, and there are a number of collaborations and shared activities between the 2 centres. We'll now delve a little bit closer into some of the areas of research from each of our speakers. So from our point of view at Pawsey, we've helped support researchers that have discovered new galaxies through this year to helping to improve some of the diagnostic tests for coronavirus. We've also helped accelerate other research across chemical and physical engineering and more. So we'll delve down into some of that research now, and I'll stick with you, Amanda, and ask you to tell us a little bit about your research and how does supercomputing support you in your work.
Thanks. So my research generally is in computational science, and so this involves a combination of high performance computing and a lot of applied machine learning and applied artificial intelligence, specifically aimed at trying to solve problems in the physical sciences. This includes areas such as nanoscience, where I traditionally did a lot of work in the past, but also chemistry and physics and material science and engineering. And my group focuses mainly on using interpretable machine learning methods. And we spend a lot of time researching how all of the outstanding algorithms that have been developed in computer science, which I would say are typically designed for very large and very well-behaved data sets, and figuring out how they can be applied to data sets in the physical sciences, which have a lot of numerical problems and biases. One of the aspects of this is trying to create also large synthetic data sets using simulations. And we do this because this enables us to explore issues around how the models cope with sample sizes, how we do appropriate feature selection, how we might handle the curse of dimensionality, in which dimension reduction methods can be interpretable and useful, and other issues around interpretable results, because particularly in the physical sciences, we need to be able to action the results that we get from AI. It's not sufficient that we get a bit more of an answer about what we already knew. We need it to inform what we do next. And we can't make big data or analyze big data without big supercomputers.
Yeah, oh, very good. So what do you, I think you've almost answered that question, I think, in my follow-up is what's the research potential do you think that is offered through our new system when it comes on stream in the next 18 months that you can't do today?
The bigger computer is definitely going to allow us to scale up. It'll enable us to study larger and much more complex feature spaces, much more consistent with experimental observations. And it'll also enable us to explore a number of alternative methods, such as the ones that are in computer vision, which is difficult at the moment for the physical sciences. And for this, of course, we need very large data sets to be able to work on them. As an example, we're currently exploring the possibility of converting small tabular data sets from material science into images using Kahana networks, and then using image processing and data augmentation methods to turn hundreds of data points, which is typical in material science, into hundreds of thousands of data points, which is typical in computer vision. And once we've got them, we'll also need the Pawsey computer to train the deep neural networks and hopefully extract some new insights that we just wouldn't have been done before using the conventional approach to machine learning in the field.
So I think we've got members here in the audience that are researchers and would follow what your research is going to enable in terms of its application and its impact. Is it going to have great application in areas for, say, autonomous vehicles in smart cities and the technology to enable that? Is that the sort of thing that you could see advanced by this research?
Well, we're very interested in general approaches, which are agnostic to definitely the type of area and data set in the physical sciences. More broadly in the group, we have people working in bioinformatics, computational biology, and health informatics, and other areas of science as well. The advantage of being in a computer science department is that we're exposed to all kinds of other areas such as social sciences, economics, transport, as you mentioned. Yeah. And so we can both learn from some of the methods that they use for in robotic vision and computer vision for things like autonomous vehicles. And hopefully we'll be able to contribute to the research in that area, because we handle unique problems in the physical sciences. And anytime we can solve a unique problem, it might inform a rare case in some of the more traditional areas, such as autonomous vehicles.
Yeah, tremendous. Okay, well, you mentioned health in there, so that's a segue to you, Alan. So you study how biological systems function in atomic detail, from how cell membranes form to how viruses penetrate them and drugs affect them, which is incredibly topical every day now in terms of the times that we're living through. So can you talk us through how supercomputers aid you in your research? And you might also want to reference some of the significant databases that you've created through your research.
Yeah, so the thing which drives our research is the fact that you can't see atoms. Nobody's ever seen an atom, so everything that we know about molecular systems at an atomic level to some degree have all come from models. And so what we do is molecular dynamics, where we describe the interactions between the atoms in the system. We generate an underlying physical model, and then we use the computers to be able to simulate how these systems evolve in time. We have to take incredibly small dimensions and incredibly small time steps. So the amount of computer resources required to do this work is significant. And look, the easiest way that I could illustrate what we actually do is to put it on the screen behind me. And so this is, if I actually move back a little bit, what you're actually seeing here is the antibiotic vancomycin, which is actually considered to be a very rigid molecule, a very rigid antibiotic. And it actually binds to a target molecule, which is the one you can see in little spheres, which is actually diala-diala. It's the end of lipid 2, which is a component which is used to make bacterial cell walls. So if you can actually bind to lipid 2, you block cell wall development. And vancomycin survived as a antibiotic for something like about 45 years, the longest ever antibiotic before there was resistance developed. So what we actually do is these types of simulations where we can actually watch molecules spontaneously assemble. This is a relatively small case. We do it on much larger ones as well, but it simply illustrates the fact that if we can get the underlying physics correct, and you'll see it just in a minute that the molecule actually binds in the middle of vancomycin, not on the edge, and it'll actually slot in, and we can actually predict these with equivalent or better accuracy than you can get from experiment. And really, it's a question is that, look, it's lovely to do it for vancomycin in a small scale. What we really want to be able to do is to be able to look at how, if I put up a slightly different one, this is actually the erythropoietin receptor. And some of you might know this was one of Lance Armstrong's favorite drug targets because it actually stimulates blood production. And what we're actually interested in this case is actually how this receptor manages to send a mechanical signal from binding something on the outside of a cell to actually sending a mechanical and then chemical signal inside the cell, which then triggers a response. And this is the main work that our group does. Scale is incredibly important. I'd love to do a cell, but that's only about 10 or 20,000 times greater than what we can do at the moment. When you actually mentioned about, well, how is this affecting the current pandemic? The other element that we really work on and what we've been using Pawsey for is that the key thing in all of these is to be able to describe the molecules correctly. The more accurately we can describe it, the better our predictions are going to be, the less we will need animal testing, the faster these processes can occur. And so if we're actually seeking the current pandemic, one of the real difficulties is that you can't do classic drug design. We don't want novel molecules. These will take years, if not a decade, to be able to take to the market once we go through all the safety testing. But what we can do is that we can try and repurpose drugs. So we can, and you're already seeing that. I mean, remdesivir and dexamethasone are two good examples of where people have taken an existing drug and applied them. And, you know, both of these were expected to work because they're closely related to the mechanism of action. You could also see it can go disastrously wrong with chloroquine, which looked very good in the beginning. There was good reasons to test it, but certainly is not something you'd want to take now with what's known. So that what we've been doing is taking all known clinical drugs, because people can computationally screen those quite rapidly. If there's an accurate enough description of those molecules, we can screen against the known structures of the viral proteins and look for which ones bind. There are around about 13,000 molecules which have passed through clinical trials. And so what we've actually been using Pawsey resources for is, and other facilities around the country and internationally, is to systematically go through every known drug, parameterize these at a high level so they can be used in screening, and not just look at the drug which is currently active, but look at all alternative forms of all of those drugs. Some drugs, like common ones like warfarin, can exist in 40 different forms, and it's no good just to consider one form. We have to consider all forms in these screening exercises. I mean, it's a massive task, but it's a lot better for, you know, one group to do it well and to distribute this publicly throughout the world, which is what we do. We actually have a site which is really driven by the facilities available nationally. So this is actually dexamethasone. It's a molecule which will exist in multiple different forms. And we have, at the moment, we have in our database about 10 different forms of dexamethasone, which could be used for docking studies. We have about 470,000 molecules in our total database and about 13,000 users of our site worldwide. And it's really, without the supercomputer facilities, these things wouldn't exist. It's actually taken us 10 years of a lot of computer time, literally 50 million hours of supercomputer time in order to get the database up at this level. And it's one of these things that we're hoping that it's urgent now, but it will also, for the next pandemic, have a lasting legacy. If we had this in place before the pandemic, we would be able to process potential molecules much faster.
Tremendous. It's a sobering thought that you just said next pandemic, but at the moment we'll send all of our positive thoughts to you and your colleagues to continue your good work and help us through this one. So from matters atomic to matters astronomic, as a segue to you, Melanie, the Pawsey Supercomputing Centre has been an integral part of the national radio astronomy and international radio astronomy effort since it was established. And in fact, it was 75 years ago to a couple of weeks ago that there was the first radio astronomy experiment in Australia. And there's been a very strong relationship between computing and advances in scientific computing and radio astronomy since its earliest days. So the Australian science computing environment has had that very strong and direct relationship. So Melanie, you've played a part in major telescope design and construction in your career. Can you tell us a little bit about your work and the research possibilities that will be enabled by our new supercomputing system?
Yeah, so my work is actually, in addition to building and designing and operating radio telescopes, it's looking at very faint signals that we have from you know, galaxy clusters in the universe. So that's one of the things that I do. So that's a difficult experiment to do with a radio telescope. And I think your point about the interrelation between radio astronomy developments and supercomputing's kind of really been an interesting journey over my career. So when I started my PhD 20 years ago now, more than 20 years ago now, it used to be the case that I would collect data on a telescope in New South Wales, the compact array, and I would book time on a computer in Sydney. They would give me 2 gig of disk space, and I would have to go to Sydney to be able to reduce the data from the telescope, which is it was a really minimal amount of data. And I spent sort of 3 years getting what ended up to be 9 data points. And this was because radio astronomy hardware at that stage was ahead of computing. As computing evolved, my first generation of PhD students could do all their processing on laptops. But we've been through a sort of renaissance in the radio astronomy hardware now. And so we're back to this situation where you need very large scale HPC to be able to process the data. And so I've got an illustration of the evolution that we've had, which I'm going to share my screen and hopefully show you. So see if that comes up. Can you see that?
Yes.
All right. So this is an image of Centaurus A, which is the nearest radio galaxy to us. And that image is about 18 degrees on the sky. So that's taken with the radio telescope that I used for my PhD. It was a project led by my colleague, Alana Fayan, that I was on. Now, in order to be able to make that image, when we did this, we started that project in 2006, we had to stitch together 400 images taken with a radio telescope of that size. And it took us 2 years to collect the data. It took us then another 2 years to process it with the existing HPC. And this is what you get now with the MWA in 2 minutes. That's that same object. And because of the advances in HPC and the fact that we've got Pawsey, you can actually process that pretty much instantaneously. So a piece of work that took us 5 years from collection to publishing, you can now do in a matter of weeks if you wanted to. So that's an enormous acceleration in the astronomy knowledge creation pipeline, if you like. But having said that, we've got to this stage now where we're producing so much data that we're back to this situation where we're sort of limited to the data rate and the computational throughput. So it's been a sort of an interesting cyclic journey for me over the last 20 years. And I think the other thing which is really interesting for me to think about as someone who is involved in the operation and design of new radio telescopes is how that interrelation between computing and hardware shapes how people think about things. So there's a human element which I think is really fascinating and has evolved. So when I started, I was using this telescope here, the compact array, the one that you can see with the dishes. And driving that telescope and observing with that telescope is actually quite expensive. And at the time, it was far more expensive to use the telescope than to store the data. And so I was told as a PhD student that every visibility that we collected, every piece of data was absolutely precious. We should put it in an archive and you shouldn't re-observe the same part of the sky. You should just go back and reprocess the data. Telescope that we're using now is, well, the one that I'm using now is the one on the right, the Murchison Wide Field Array, which is here in Western Australia, up in the Midwest. And you can see that that looks a bit like metallic spiders and it has no moving parts. And observing with that instrument is actually really cheap, whereas the data rate is enormous. And so if you keep storing things, you need to continually refresh your storage archive. And so in some senses, what you would want to do is use the sky as your archive. So if you're looking at astronomical events and assuming that your environment doesn't get degraded by Elon Musk and his Starlink projects, then you should, in theory, be able to come back and observe the same object as long as it's, on tens of years lifetime, as opposed to storing data and, continuing to expand an archive, which you then need more and more HPC to process. So I think there's a really interesting thing because the generation of astronomers that I'm from are still left in this paradigm from before when we've moved and evolved both in terms of the hardware and also the compute. And so flipping that paradigm on its head, I think, and working with colleagues at Pawsey as to how we go forward is a really interesting way to approach this problem of big data that we're going to have in astronomy in the future.
Yeah, tremendous. It is an exciting challenge, but an opportunity, and we're seeing that in, I guess, different domains where science historically generates data through hypothesis and experimentation, and you're trained in that way. But we're now having this deluge of data made available to us, so it's changing the way scientists think about some of their methodologies and past practices. So we'll look forward to the future of supercomputing in this next little section and encourage people to ask some questions if they have them, and we will prepare for the Q&A. I think you've got an insight into some of the possibilities of supercomputing, how it can enable high impact research from here in Australia. So I'm going to ask my panelists what sort of scientific breakthroughs that we could expect to see, and what sort of the impact of this advanced technology could have on the Australian research community and the technology sector more broadly. So I'll ask Alan first. What do you think the role of supercomputing will play in the future of healthcare?
Well, I think it can be indicated in an indirect way. I was looking up one American company, Amgen, for just genome sequencing and gene analysis for drug development, has bought themselves a 4-petaflop computer, and it's only used for one task. They have a separate one which is used for drug design. So what I really think that what we're moving to is in medicine is two things. One is certainly the statistical analysis of how you could actually deal with new treatments rather than over very large populations, and we're seeing that occurring currently. The other way is to go to very minute detail, and we can go into predictive medicine. So one of the projects that we've been very interested in is actually, can we predict which bacteria are going to be capable of evolving resistance to a particular biocide? So will a particular drug be safe to use in the future, or will we develop resistance? People I know are trying to predict what will be the nature of the mutations which are occurring in viruses now, so that we will know in advance that when we get one of these mutations, we will know there is a potential for another spread. And I think this is where the ability to take the genomic information, to take very high performance computing, and to be able to take very predictive models in order to be able to short circuit our approach to medicine rather than being reactive will be where we go in the future. Very personalized.
Yeah, I think you've anticipated one of the questions from one of our colleagues. So we've got some people, my colleagues in the Pawsey exhibition space, but one of my colleagues has asked that question about, clearly you can investigate a larger number of drugs and molecules with the compute, but the ability to design more accurate or complex models underpinning your simulations, that should be enabled by a higher performance computing capability at Pawsey.
Yeah, look, I mean, certainly it can. I mean, what we know at the moment is the models we use to get to the timescales we required are relatively crude. I mean, they perform well, but there is no question that we could make these a lot better. The accuracy that you need for predicting a drug is within a few kilojoules a mole. Look, the way that I think will go, one of the heads of Roche development quite a number of years ago, I was trying to pitch to him a particular method which I thought would be fast. And he said to me, methods only have to be fast when they don't work. He said, what we want is accuracy. If your methods are accurate enough that we no longer have to do the experiment, that's when we will advance drug design. And I think that's what we have to aim for.
Okay, thank you. Well, methods and accuracy, I think I'm going to segue this one to Amanda for my next question. So what sort of challenges do you think can be unlocked in the next decade through supercomputers in terms of your research?
Okay, well, I've thought about this, and I think sort of taking a big picture approach, I think supercomputing will enable, in combination with data analytics and machine learning and AI, will enable us to move to a paradigm where artificial intelligence can be used as a planning tool rather than an analysis tool. I think more and more all of the different conventional areas of science and engineering are going to start being data-driven, and this will enable us to prioritize what we do next. Every time we have a scientific discovery, there's always lots of things you can do, but which one should you do? So I think over the next 10 years that everyone is going to become data-driven and everyone's going to become computational to some degree. It's going to be an imperative for us to be able to move forward more rapidly in scientific research. I also think that we'll start to see a lot of more real-time monitoring in science as well as in other sectors. And this will require some serious real-time computation to extract value and make immediate decisions based on what's happening in the moment. And finally, I think that, as Alan's alluded to, our models are just going to become more and more sophisticated. In the past, we developed approximations and algorithms to cope with computational limits. And we've heard this from Melanie as well. And now we're not faced with those limits. Those limits are being lifted. And so this will enable us all to dream big and develop models that do not need to compromise.
I've just grabbed Dream Big. We might recruit you into our marketing team as well, Amanda. So that's cool.
I think someone's already thought of that phrase. I didn't come up with that.
Well, yes, we will be mindful of copyright. So Melanie, over to you. What kind of scientific discoveries do you think will be possible in radio astronomy through supercomputing in the next decade?
Yeah, well, all of them, which sounds like a flippant answer, but it's not. So supercomputing is absolutely fundamental to the way that radio telescopes work. So without Pawsey, the Murchison Wide Field Array telescope wouldn't be able to do anything with the signals that we collect. And as we go forward to instruments like the SKA, although we're not super rate limited now, we are going to be rate limited again as we were when I started my PhD. So the SKA component that's going to be built here in Australia, SKA Low, is going to see over 130,000 antennas deployed in the Murchison over a 65-kilometre area. So at the moment, the MWA is 4,000. So you can see that sort of scale up, 4,000 to 130,000 is a big jump. And that instrument's going to produce 157 terabytes of data a second. So 32,000 DVDs worth of data per second. And if you don't have a supercomputer to ingest that and turn it into something that we can turn into images, you've got a problem. So we need a supercomputer and HPC up there on the site, potentially. And then you also need one to then take the 1 petabyte of imaging data and cubes that we're going to produce and actually extract knowledge out of it. So one of the problems that we're going to have in the future, and that we're starting to have now, is that an SKA cube is 50,000 by 50,000 pixels and 65,000 channels. We produce one of those every 10 hours. So if you think about the volume, the search volume parameter space that you're looking at to extract knowledge, you can't have people eyeball those things anymore. So that is all going to need to be put on HPC. And we're going to have to develop new methodologies to turn those data into knowledge. So one of the things that I think is most interesting about big data, when you talk to people about big data, is they think that big data is the end to itself. You know, we've got big data. Big data is useless if you can't actually extract value and knowledge from it. And it's that part that I think HPC is absolutely critical for. But in terms of the type of science that we're going to do, I hope that we're going to get to do some things which I think are particularly interesting. So I'm going to share one last thing, which is this. So as I mentioned before when I was talking about my research, so my actual astronomy research is looking at faint signals from when galaxy clusters collide. So matter of the universe is coming around gravitational well. And if you can take God's view of the universe, it looks like a sort of demented spider's web in terms of where the matter sits. And one of the things that happens is you get shock waves, and those shock waves accelerate electrons, and the electrons then light up in the radio, and they're very hard to detect. And this is a simulation done on a computer of what the radio cosmic web would look like. So this was work done by my PhD student, Torrance, who is using Pawsey as part of his project at the moment to try and work out whether or not we're going to be able to detect the cosmic web in radio with either current or next generation radio telescopes. So that's, I think, the truly exciting thing for me that we hope we'll be able to do in the future, and we will not be able to do it without supercomputing to help us reduce the data and then extract the knowledge from the data that we collect.
Very cool. Well, I didn't see any of my colleagues leave the exhibition space when you talked about the challenges that we have ahead of us. So I think we're up for the challenge, and we'll see how we go. So look, before we go to Q&A, I'll ask one more question of Amanda, and Amanda's been involved in chairing our user reference group and important in supporting that process. But we've just launched this week a program that we're calling PACER, which is a program to help prepare researchers for this new supercomputing system, and a program to support them staying at the forefront of computational science. Amanda, I'm interested to see your views on what the importance of this sort of program is working with Australian researchers.
Yes, I think the PACER program is an outstanding opportunity for Australian researchers to join the efforts that actually shape this field globally. It's very rare for us to have an opportunity to do research into HPC, not just research on HPC. And the two of them really do need to go hand in glove if we're to be globally competitive. PACER is all about collaboration and making sure that Australian computational science is exascale ready both in terms of our ability to take advantage of the hardware and also our scientific aspirations. So for any of you out there who are thinking of applying, my advice is to dream big, because we've heard that Mark likes that term, but also to think carefully about how you're going to do it, not just what you're going to do.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your ongoing support of that program. I can see my colleague Maciej Stutowski in the exhibition space. He's leading the PACER initiative, and we'll be pleased with the shout out. We might look at our marketing, but we think it's got a pretty catchy name too. So, look, we've got a couple of questions, and we'll now go into a Q&A session. I think Marco, thank you for your question, but as Alan was on that topic, I think I picked up that one. There is one more for Alan from Mohammed. Alan, are you mentioning the network analysis of the drug to select the particular drug before starting the computational study?
I'm not quite sure what Mohammed means precisely by that question. The thing that we're actually interested in ourselves is that, and this also comes into actually the problem of structural determination of actually even knowing which drug is actually bound to a protein. Many of the structures that are in the current databases are actually flawed. Sometimes they've even got the wrong molecule in them, which may seem quite amazing, but it's just down to the difficulty of solving the structures, knowing what's in your mixture, and also the fact that you impose a model. You have to decide what form of the drug you put in there. Is it protonate? Is it deprotonated? So when people are actually screening drugs, we're finding that the models that people are using are often incorrect. In drug bank, for example, aspirin is put in a neutral form, whereas in solution, aspirin would be an acid. And that's a very trivial case. There are 2 forms of warfarin in drug bank, but we know there's over 40 possible in solution. And so we're trying to at first expand out and to calculate which forms of these molecules are actually most common in solution, and then again, which forms will be most likely to bind, because you need to know both.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I've got a question around if you like, the human side of this, the skills and the human labour required for big science. What does HPC need to do to make sure that the human labour efficiency of big science scales along with the compute? And that's open for anyone to comment on.
I'll jump in. So I think that's one of the great advantages of PACER. PACER over the next few years will provide opportunities for researchers to become more involved in HPC infrastructure and delivery, and increase the amount of skills that Australia has in this field. So this means that our researchers and our developers become more attuned with the new hardware that's coming in the field that they need to be able to adapt to. And on the other flip side of that is our HPC specialists are exposed to the intricate details of how we think as researchers and what our needs are, so that it brings along the skills and the expertise of both of these 2 important sides of the coin, if you will.
Yeah.
Can I pick up on Amanda's point that she's just raised? I think it's really critically important for researchers to work with HPC specialists to accelerate, sorry, someone's trying to talk to me, their data flows. And I think there's a tendency in science for, domain experts in science to kind of go, oh, we'll do the HPC part. And we're really getting to a stage where that's not sensible. You don't want radio astronomers trying to write algorithms to be efficiently deployed on HPC. You want them to come up with the algorithm and then to work with HPC specialists to be able to make those things scale and then be deployed efficiently. And so I think there's a really important cultural shift in how we work together across the community to make the best of the hardware and the science that we can do.
If I could comment also briefly myself, the other aspect that we do actually need is not just users at the lower level. You really need to make sure that the expertise is distributed across the community. That's, I think, one of the differences, and I think Amanda is championing this well, one of the differences you notice in some of the universities in Europe as opposed to in Australia is that that the HPCs don't just provide services. They're also places for teaching. They're places where students can go to learn about algorithms, because you even have to know something about algorithms before you, and the architecture of the computers, before you can even propose an algorithm for somebody more specialized to implement. And keeping the knowledge in the groups of how to compile, how to optimize, I think it's important that this is across the community.
Yeah. And there's a message there in that the architecture in our new system is going to have a much greater adoption of GPU technology, and so there are some implications there. Does anyone want to comment on that for any particular researchers or domains?
I think it's important to everybody because they're so much more energy efficient. There was a nice study that came out of MIT recently where they were speculating that we're actually approaching the limits of deep learning because the cost of running and training the models is greater than their worth. We need to embrace this energy efficiency. I think decreasing the carbon footprint of our research is something that we all need to care about.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Look, sorry, yes, Alan?
I just also just, you know, the people to realize just the way that the GPUs are driving it, that the advances. It's actually nice that we can piggyback on a consumer market which is expanding so rapidly, and it's really been driving the price performance that we can get of your system.
Oh, tremendous. There was a question in the chat around Pawsey and the Australian Space Data Analytics Facility, which I won't ask any of the panelists because they may not know anything about it specifically. But Pawsey recently partnered with the Australian Space Agency and the WA Data Science Innovation Hub to establish a facility to support data assets using space infrastructure and make that available to industry and SME and so on. It's in a startup phase, and we have just recently made some staffing appointments in terms of data scientists and business development, and appointed an advisory board that's going to meet next month. And so we'll start to communicate more widely to the national research community about how to access that facility. So I didn't see the name of the person that asked that question, but watch this space, if you like, for Pawsey and the space data facility. But it's a very positive development and something we're keen to promote here. We also have an Ask Me Anything Monday event next week. So regularly, Pawsey has an event to encourage people to just meet Pawsey staff. So several of the staff you see up in the exhibition space will be available to take Q&A from anyone in the audience around developments around PACER and any of the programs that we support. We are getting towards the end. I think we've got time for one more question. If I just scroll down my list. Ed, I didn't catch Ed's first name, but beyond, this is to all panelists, beyond increasing computing power, so how is Pawsey and the wider Australian science community enabling reproducibility and making these vast data more readily available?
So I can jump into that. So one of the things the astronomical community has been doing for the last 20 years is where we have collected data and put it in archives, or we've imaged it, we make that globally available. And in the case of the Murchison Wide Field Array, Pawsey is absolutely integral to that. So we have something called the ASVO. So we have the MWA node of the Australian Virtual Observatory, and that's a service run through Pawsey where we serve out all of the MWA data that's collected to anyone in the world after an 18-month proprietary period. So anyone can come and take the observations that we've collected and re-reduce them and, you know, verify reproducibility. And also we don't limit it to those people that are, or those institutions that are members of the telescope and provide the operational funding for the telescope. So 18 months, anyone in the world can do that.
Okay. Well, I think I will start to wrap it up. There's two last points I'd like to make. There's a colleague on the line from Western Sydney University, and we'll reach out to you to talk about how WSU accesses resources at Pawsey through the national merit schemes and other partnership opportunities. So So thanks, Jeff, for your question. And there was a last question that I won't ask a panelist to ask, but it was pointing to the industry engagement opportunities around advances in this science and its applications in industry. And that's very much on the agenda here for Pawsey and for NCI. Both our national centres need to, and all our researchers need to have a very clear sort of path to impact view with their research. It's very important for all of our research. So that is something that we're doing more and more about. So we'll start to wrap it up here, and I'd like to thank the panelists for really engaging conversation and insights into high performance computing, into supercomputing at Pawsey and in Australia. Thank Amanda, Alan and Melanie for your insights and for your continued support of Pawsey and your leadership in your disciplines and in computing science generally. Thank you to my colleagues Aditi and Karina and behind the scenes who've helped make this event happen. We will record it and make it available to you through the Pawsey website and other channels. And we will have the Pawsey Monday event that I've mentioned next week. And on that note, I think I'll just double check the chat before I close it from here. We will, any of the questions that I didn't get to pick up, we'll respond to those as part of the video when we make it available. And do appreciate all of your efforts. I think, Alan, that image of you talking with your molecules floating around was excellent, and insights into the cosmic dark web, Melanie, behind you were great. Amanda, we might need to work on some backgrounds for you, but I no doubt you've got the computational insights to wow us in that way as well. I've just got the analog version behind me. Thanks everyone. Please take care, keep safe, and really do appreciate your support today. Thank you.